Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everywhere you are in the world. Today, Smart Brain Insights podcast is bringing a very special guest. We have with us the COO of Neuro-Link. I wish it would be Smart Brain Insights, but it's Neuro-Link, our partner company in South Africa, who is going to be our special guest for this next 3 episodes. His name, Tiaan Vermeulen. Tiaan is a neurophysiologist, and he'll tell you a little bit more about himself in a minute. But I am so blessed to have been working with Tiaan for over a decade now, enhancing the life of people through the concept of Neuro Agility. Tiaan, are you with me?
I am with you. Thank you so much for having me, Edith.
Fantastic. Well, tell us a little bit about you yourself. I know you grew up in the Neuro-Link family since a child, and where you are
Most,
today.
most definitely. So the passion of the brain actually started when we were very young. My father understood the brain. He understood the learning implications of the brain, and the brain was also always a topic of discussion when we sat at the dining room table having dinner. And everything sort of just rolled into that direction. I went to go study physiology, genetics, and psychology. I majored in all three of those areas. And I thought, well, I like the physiology. I love the process, not just the looking at a organ, or I want to understand how this works. Now, it has proven to be very difficult to understand even a little bit about it. But that is where it started, and it sort of just got momentum. And I just went on doing my honors in neurophysiology. I completed my master's in neurophysiology. I specifically looked at a structure in the brain that they refer to as the corpus callosum, looking at the shape of that structure that connects the two hemispheres together. And we compared that research with normal type of individuals to schizophrenic and bipolar individuals to see if there were any shape changes and structural changes, and then relating it to the physiology, the understanding how that translates into the function. And it was very interesting research, but it just kept on going. And I thought, well, the next step would be for me to do my PhD. So at the moment, I'm currently busy doing my PhD in neuroanatomy, specifically focusing on the accessory nerve, which is a cranial nerve in the brain. And it innervates essentially these muscles in your neck here that's standing out, and then here on your back. But it's especially very clinically significant because we don't really have a roadmap on the connections and the course of that nerve, and there's a lot of issues with surgical interventions that if we don't exactly know where that nerve exits and that type of thing, it does create iatrogenic issues after the surgery, and complications after the surgery. So it's very clinically significant, but it's important to understand what that physiology is all about. So that's in a nutshell where that passion is. But I must say, you also have that passion for the brain.
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. Working with Neurolink for the last 15 years, and recently acquiring my certification as a neuroplastician. But I'm more in the development side. I just love the way you can explain all this physiology of the brain and the way we actually learn, grow, and develop ourselves. And I think that's going to be the core probably of this conversation, Tian. When we talk about the physiology of the brain, what are those things that are relevant to us when it comes to understanding the anatomy of our brain and how we need to keep it nurtured, feed it, take care. I call it the brain health, right? And it's this idea of the more we care about the brain, the more We can become neuro agile. Now we can become more better learners. There's a lot of preoccupation on people on how do I exercise the brain to prevent mental illnesses, and especially the decay that comes with age, and and the neuroplasticity, which I hope the next episode we will talk about neuroplasticity a lot. But on this one, I just want to talk about that magnificent structure called the brain.
Perfect, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. And as you started speaking, you mentioned that application or that development aspects to the brain. And the beauty of the work that I do is, yes, I do the academics, but why I chose also to do the work that we do in Neuro-Link, which is also the development aspects of the brain, is that I think there's a big gap between looking at the brain from an academic perspective and then looking at it from a actual real life situation perspective. It's easy to say something in theory, but does it really translate to those development implications? And the beauty about this is we try to fix or fill that gap in translating the sciences to making a difference in people's lives. And that's the beauty of looking at the brain is it's not just a physical organ. It's much more complicated than that. If you look at the structures of the brain, if you look at the functions related to those structures, a funny fact is there was this notion that we only use 10% of our brains. And
I was going to say something about that. Yes, that was going to be my question. By the way, I was going to say, Tiaan, is it true that we only use like 10% of the brain? But now you're on it. Just keep going, please.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The researchers, it was many years ago, and there was one specific researcher that mentioned we would probably only understand 10% of the brain because it's so complex, and it just got lost in translation to we only use 10% of the brain. So it's we all use our entire brain. I mean, sometimes, Edith, maybe sometimes it does feel to us that we don't use everything,
Sometimes I feel like I don't have a brain.
And that's normal. We all go through that. And if we look at just the small little aspects of the brain and some of the things that we can do to mitigate those negative impacts that we experience or symptoms that we experience. For example, stress. That's a massive thing. I mean, Edith, you have your own business. I mean, there's a lot of things that you go through daily that could be a stressor if you don't cope with it correctly. Am I right?
That's correct. And for me, Tiaan, the biggest thing is the misunderstanding that is out there with stress. Because for some people, stress is like, oh, when they cannot handle anymore. And for other people, it's almost an overused word that when there's a little bit of uncertainty, I'm stressed out. So let's make a stop right now. And physiologically speaking, explain stress to me or to us, actually.
Perfect. I'm so glad that you're asking that question. I was actually leading up to that as well. So I must say we're on a good good wavelength.
Many years working together, we get to that point.
Oh yes, definitely. So, and it's so important because there's so many adverse effects of stress. So if we look at the physiology of stress, we refer to it as the HPA axis. It's the hypothalamic adrenal or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it's a very complicated process in terms of hormones that gets released. But essentially, when you look at the brain, you have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus speaks to your pituitary gland. Those two release certain hormones. And as they release the hormones, they stimulate certain hormones that releases cortisol from your adrenal glands. Now, your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys, which we don't always know that's actually where cortisol is produced or secreted. And that then goes into the body. And when you do not regulate your cortisol secretion, if it gets to a specific level, there's a negative feedback loop that tries to stop that stress response. But when we are in that stress response continuously, you don't get to a point where your brain actually becomes cognizant of switching that process off. So it's a entire it affects so many other aspects. It affects your nervous system. It affects the way that you produce certain other chemicals. I mean, you've probably experienced this when you drive and you have to hit the brakes, that adrenaline type of response. That's a stress response. And that's what we sometimes get even just with emotions. There's so many types of stresses or triggers to those stresses that could initiate that response, and we need to take control of that. So yes, sometimes stress is okay, but for short little bouts, it keeps you alert. It could keep you focused. But as soon as you go over that threshold, you might lose control. And essentially, from a development aspect, that is what stress is losing control. I think you've probably experienced this in the workplace as well, where people lose control.
Oh, yes. Just recently, actually, not even at work, but actually even in social and professional environments, like meetings and stuff. Sometimes you wonder why so-and-so had this kind of response. And then you realize there's something going on in their lives that causes a very stressful response that can come across as anger or a meltdown or being almost like rude to another person, when in reality it's a very stressful response, not intended to be that way, but that's how it comes across, because we're losing control of our I would like to say our filters, right? It's almost like we lose that ability to gauge what we are, because we're not at our best, brainly speaking.
Exactly. Yes, and from a physiological point of view, your brain and your body always strives to find a point of homeostasis, and that's a point of balance. And when that balance is thrown out with high bouts of cortisol that's released, that's where those negative symptoms are produced out in our environment. And that's why we'll sometimes react in a way that sometimes I didn't even know that I would react this way. I mean, if you just look at the physiology of stress alone, the negative impact that has on your immune system, on your mental state, on your memory. I mean, it also affects your emotions, because you get through a negative, or that it's almost like a negative spiral just going down, because you just keep on creating those mental pathways. And that's where the neuroplasticity comes in, is creating those mental pathways that actually inhibit you from succeeding, but staying in that rut the entire time. And that's where we get frustrated a lot of the time when we work with others. I mean, I know with the work that you've done as well, using the assessments, the NAP assessments as well, where you've seen people have access to both hemispheres, but at a certain point, when the stress is just enough and the environment, everything, the recipe is just perfect, that person loses control and they react in that manner of their default preferences. I don't know if you have something, if you had a similar thing, or something that you could share with us from your perspective, that you've seen people go into that default mode in their thinking preference.
Definitely, I will tell you my own story for a minute. We're almost at the end of the episode, but this stress is something we can be talking for many episodes. So I will invite you back just for stress. The idea here is I used to get triggered, even though when I teach emotional intelligence for many years, and those frameworks, but there was something that triggers me, and it had to do a little bit with when people have this fast, commanding, pitchy voice, and at the same time the conversation is stressful and there's noises in the background, and I was just having these palpitations And even though when I was able to control, obviously, I have closed caption on my face. People can read that I was getting stressed, even if I didn't react to it. But the idea here is that sometimes I didn't even know what was triggering me, came to know later, and this is something that we will continue explaining in other episodes, so stay tuned. But I came in the awareness of learning that I lead my thinking process with my left hemisphere. At the same time, I was left ear dominant. And our senses communicate crossover, as you know, where you know more about this than I do, because you're the physiologist here. But the idea here is that I was listening to how people say things, and that they call that the musical ear. And then I was difficult for me to comprehend if I had noises in the background. So in this case, my stress level was biological in a way. I was not even aware that I was left ear dominant. Most people don't even know if they are. That's the beauty of when you call it the NAP, Neuro Agility profile, for those of us who don't know what the NAP is. But it's this profile that we do and help us understand what are your dominants and how that is impacting the way you capture and process information. So I was being victim of this stressor that it was by default in my biology, in the way I was wired. I say I was because thanks to neuroplasticity, I was able to shift that. But stress will be triggering me. I will have palpitations, and then immediately I had to make that stop and choose my response. Thankfully, I knew all those tools. But at the end of the day, if we don't have those tools, then we will have responses that we don't even understand where they came from, because we don't have that awareness. And the idea here with stress is getting to know an accurate self-awareness by learning what your neurological design is. And with that, we're almost coming at the end of our session today. And I would like to say, stay tuned, because Tiaan and I will continue this conversation in the next episode. Tiaan, any closing words?
Your brain is amazing, and don't fall into the trap in telling yourself that you can't do something. If you keep on telling yourself you can, even if you don't believe it at first, you'll get to a point where you manipulate your brain to create a neural pathway to know that you can succeed. So don't get despondent. Thank you for watching this episode with us, and please stay tuned for the rest. I think there's very interesting information that we'll be sharing with you in the upcoming episodes.
Absolutely. And some people might be watching, others will be just hearing it in Spotify. But the idea here is, let's learn about our brain. We're putting neuro in front of everything, and that's going to be part of our next episode. Thank you for staying tuned, and we will meet you in the next episode.